Welcome, everyone. I'm Lorelei Tangi, University Librarian at UC Irvine. We are offering a live transcription of this event, which you can turn on at the bottom of your screen by selecting closed captioning or view the full transcript. Today, we are honored to welcome Janice Munemitsu, author of The Kindness of Color, The Story of Two Families, and Mendez et alia versus Westminster, the 1947 desegregation of California public schools. Before we get into our main program, I would like to start with an acknowledgement of our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Hashiman and Tongva peoples. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker and share a bit about her background. Janice Munemitsu is a third-generation Japanese-American sansei. After working more than 20 years in consumer goods marketing and branding, Janice now serves as a board member for a number of nonprofits. A native of Orange County, California, Janice worked on the family farm in Westminster from age 5 through high school. When her family was illegally incarcerated in 1945, they leased their farm to the Mendez family, where the Mendez children were denied entry into the white-only local public school. Her book, The Kindness of Color, tells the true stories of her family and the Mendez family and how their paths intersected and led to California's school desegregation in Mendez et alia versus Westminster in 1947, 7 years before Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Now, despite the injustices and discrimination the families faced, Janice's story focuses on the cross-cultural cooperation between immigrant communities and the kindnesses that helped them towards a better future. It is important to note that this year, 2022, marks the 75th anniversary of the Mendez case. And so we are honored to celebrate the landmark case here today and have Janice share her story. Welcome, Janice. I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and honor to speak with all of you through UCI's library program. And I'd like to just go ahead and tell you more about the background of Mendez versus Westminster. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now and take you through some of the background and historical parts that you might not see if you were just focusing on the news of the case itself. So this is a picture of myself with Sylvia Mendez. She was 8 years old at the time when she moved to the farm, and she was the oldest sister of the family, and she and her two brothers were the children who were denied entrance into the regular public school. Sylvia also wrote the foreword to the book. So this is kind of our first celebratory picture of our story being put into print. But for background, Gonzalo and Felicitas Mendez are Sylvia's parents. Felicitas came as a child to the US from Puerto Rico, whereas Gonzalo came from Mexico, from Chihuahua, Mexico, when he was a child. Both of their families worked on farms when they got here, and so did Gonzalo and Felicitas as teenagers. After they met and married, they worked for a few years on the farm, and they saved their money because they were definitely entrepreneurs at heart, and they wanted to start a restaurant. So they started a restaurant, and even by the age of 30, in their early 30s, they already had a thriving cantina restaurant in Santa Ana, and were part of the business community, entrepreneurs and small business community in Santa Ana. My grandparents, Seiman Masako Munemitsu, originally my grandfather, he came in 1916, and he first came to the Torrance area of California and worked on farms there. Went back in 1921 and married my grandmother, Masako. They're from the same town, village in Japan. And this is their 1921, quote unquote, wedding picture. This picture, I think, starts to show some of the cultural integration that immigrants seem to share, regardless of what part of the world they've come from. So my grandmother here is in her traditional Japanese kimono, while my grandfather has on a more Western suit. He always wanted to be an American. I don't know what the seeds of that desire were, but he always wanted to be an American. And I think my grandparents might be the only Japanese Americans who had a portrait of George Washington on their wall. And it didn't seem so important when I was a kid. It was just like, yeah, there's George. But I think as we go through this, you'll see just his desire to have the American lifestyle and be able to pursue his dreams. I don't know how long most of you have been in Orange County, but back in the 1930s, even in the 1950s and 60s, most of Orange County was farmland. So here's a few photos from the Westminster farm that my grandfather was able to lease from an elderly woman. And it was 40 acres in Westminster. And this is the barn, this is the house. And this is where my grandfather would start his family and begin to raise his family. This is also the same farm and farmhouse, barn and farmhouse that the Mendez family would come to call home. My father, Tad, is the oldest son of Seima and Masako, and this is his Huntington Beach High School graduation picture in 1941. In the larger photo, my dad is the taller son, my uncle, the next young boy, and then my grandmother's behind them. There's another family friend and her young son in the picture. But the reason I show this picture is kind of to give you an idea. These are definitely farm boys, farm workers with their overalls, but also the cottages that you can see in the background. There's 4 pretty simple cottage buildings. At that time, a lot of the farms had or workers' cottages. So along with the family home, there were cottages right on the farm for the workers to live in. And so at this time, my grandfather had retained some workers and they were living right there on the property. My dad has kind of an unusual name, Seiko Lincoln Munemitsu. He was known as Tad. That was his nickname throughout his life. But Lincoln was his middle name. And another indication of how much my grandfather wanted to embrace America, he named his firstborn son after President Lincoln. Because my dad's birthday, you know, Lincoln's birthday is February 12th. My dad's birthday is February 13th. And so that's how he got the nickname Lincoln, or the middle name Lincoln. And possibly the nickname Tad, because we know that Lincoln's son was named Tad. My dad always used to say, especially when you kind of think through this, you know, he's got immigrant parents who want to embrace the American lifestyle. And because his birthday was always before Valentine's Day, my dad would say, it's really a good thing. He is so grateful that they didn't choose to call him Valentine instead of after President Lincoln. So that's one way we always remember my dad's middle name. The other couple interesting things about my dad, he had polio as a child, and he was very blessed to survive it, as many young children did not survive polio before the vaccines were available, but he did survive it with a disability. He had a severe limp in one of his legs. And although he did sports and worked all his life as a farmer on his feet, he did have that disability for his whole life. The other thing about my dad that's interesting is he was a young landowner. And when I say young, I mean really young. His name was on this property at the age of 10. And how that came by is one of the first kindnesses in the book. One of the first kindnesses that we come into our story is when the elderly woman who owned this land, when she passed, she gave my grandfather the first right of refusal to buy the land. And that may not seem like a big deal today, but it was a big deal then because of the alien land laws and a lot of the prejudice against Asians and immigrants. It wasn't that popular at all to make an offer like this, but she, for different reasons, loved my grandfather and she gave him this opportunity. The problem was he was an alien. He was an immigrant and could not own land. He was not a citizen of the United States. But based on some good advice from different people, from their banker and others, they found a way around this. Although my dad had a mother and a father, he had parents, he retained a legal guardian who was a Japanese American from Hawaii, who was about 10 to 12 years older than my dad. And he was able, as a guardian, to be the guardian for my father, so that when my dad was 10 years old, he actually owned land in his name with this guardianship. Kindness is taking time to help others, no matter how young they are. Another kindness through this story is my dad, when he was 8 years old, started to go to the bank with my grandfather to translate English to Japanese and then Japanese back to English to the bank. The banker was Mr. Frank Monroe. And Frank Monroe played a huge part in this story, though he probably never realized how much of his kindness really brought the story to fruition. But Frank Monroe took my dad under his wings, and basically what we would call it now is he mentored my dad in banking, in business, and he was a trusted advisor, even when his probably youngest bank client was 8 years old. So life before World War II was good. My grandfather was able to not only lease land, but own land. His children went to Huntington Beach High School, and also in elementary went to Westminster 17th Street School. And this is a family photo with my father towards the left, my uncle in the middle, my grandfather in the back, my grandfather's stepmother who lived with them after his father had died, and the two twin sisters, Kazuko and Akiko, as well as my grandmother. So very formal picture, very typical, I think, of Japanese American families in those days. On the right is a picture of my grandmother and my two aunts, Akiko and Kazuko. But this picture, again, is another one of those cultural blending pictures, whereas my grandmother has on a Western dress and the two girls have on Japanese kimonos, but are proudly holding their American blonde baby dolls. And so I think you could see, even though my aunts at this time had never been to Japan, they were embracing their culture, but also living an American lifestyle. And I think as I've talked to many classrooms and mostly classrooms, high school, junior high, and college classrooms, we come up with a lot of ways that immigrants blend their heritage with the American lifestyle. But all this changed as World War II was underway in Europe. Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And this brought total insecurity to all the Japanese Americans living in the United States, because now you look like the enemy, even if you had never been to Japan or you never even spoke Japanese. But how you looked and your last name identified you as an enemy. And so all of the hard work and kind of secure lifestyle, being farmers, was up for the unknown. My dad remembers on that Sunday morning, he was working in the fields and they had planted cabbage. And they were working out there, and someone drove by, and these men just yelled horrible racial slurs at him, which wasn't typical. So he was like, that's odd. But when they went in for lunch, they listened to the radio and found out that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And that began this whole new chapter in their lives. So this executive order on February 19th, just about 2 months later, was signed by President Roosevelt, by FDR. And this basically said that all Japanese, no matter if you're a citizen or if you're a legal resident, like my grandfather was, that you would be forcibly removed away from the coast of America. And basically you were under suspicion of being a spy. And that would be whether you're a 7-year-old little girl or if you had lived in the US for 26 years, as my grandfather had by this time. This is a photo of men who were suspected and arrested by the FBI. And there were many, but happens to be the photo that my grandfather is in. He is in the upper right-hand corner, the far right in the top row. And he, on May 14th, the FBI came to that Westminster farm and arrested him, accused him of being a spy. Now, if you personally knew my grandfather, and probably most of these men, there was just nothing about them that was spy-like. Hardworking, family-oriented, running small businesses or working for others. These were not spies. But they, because of any kind of involvement that they might have had with a community group or associations with other Japanese families, if they were well connected socially to other Japanese families, they were basically accused of being a spy. And this was the start. May 14th was the start of about 2.5 years of my grandfather being separated in a Department of Justice camp. But he was separated for about 2.5 years from the rest of the family because of this. Several days later was the day that my grandmother and the rest of the family were to leave for Poston, Arizona. And Poston is the incarceration camp right on the other side of the Colorado River. So just bordering between California and Arizona. It is a Native American Indian reservation at the time. And it's huge. It's hundreds of thousands of acres out there, but it is in the middle of a desolate desert. I call this a brave photo for Sema because you'll notice Grandpa is not in this photo. And as I mentioned, 3 days before, he was taken by the FBI. And, but also the day that they were to leave, my 2 aunts, they had been suffering from chickenpox for a few days. And so they did not leave with my grandmother and their 2 older brothers. They were retained in a hospital here in Orange County while my grandmother and my uncle and dad went to Poston on that day by train. So I just think now, I mean, my grandmother never spoke of this, but I just think this must have been the worst 3 days of her life to first see her husband unlawfully arrested by the FBI, and then 3 days later having to leave without her 2 daughters. So every family in the incarceration camps had a number. So you could see ours was 24132, but A and B 20344 were my 2 7-year-old aunts who arrived much later to the camp. It was probably a couple of weeks while they got over the chickenpox. And they were cared for by the nurses in that particular hospital. I don't know how much you know about the incarceration camps, but I'll just give you a brief overview here as part of the story. It amounted to about 120,000 Japanese Americans living in Washington, Oregon, and California, losing their freedom. So they had to sell homes, they sold businesses, whatever assets, cars they had. They could only take a suitcase and maybe whatever they could carry. So everything else had to be either sold or stored. Many people were fortunate enough to have friends who would say, please leave your things in our garage or we can put it in our barn. But some people had no resources to do that. And so they sold everything at a loss. The communities at that time just took advantage of the Japanese's predicament, and homes and businesses and cars and all these assets were sold at a major loss. As you can see, there were 10 camps to house this 120,000 people. And many of these camps were the size of small cities or small towns. Poston, actually, at almost 18,000 people, was the 3rd largest city in Arizona at the time, right behind Phoenix, Phoenix, Tucson, and then Poston was the 3rd largest city in Arizona at that time. So it just gives you a framework for how massive of a forced evacuation this was. The other thing about all these locations is many people go, where's that? And that's one of the things. They were very remote. They were very hot in the summer and cold in the winter, very high desert type of situations. And most of these were always windy and dusty because they were so remote. And so the living conditions were horrible. They had tar paper barracks to live in and about a 20 by 20 space within a long barrack for each family to live in. So I could go on and tell you more about this, but just know that these were not summer camps. These were not resort camps. These were definitely prison camps with barbed wire and armed guards so that no one would be seen trying to escape. Now, I mentioned that all assets had to be sold or have some caretaker. And this is where, again, Mr. Frank Monroe steps into the picture. My father was 20 at the time and didn't know what he should do. The whole world is at war. What is the best advice? And Mr. Monroe had a lot of faith. He dared to dream that the war would end and that our family could come back. And in fact, he was right. But when the whole world is at war, it's a little bit hard to see that when it might end. But that was Mr. Monroe's idea, to have faith that it would end and also try to lease the farm. So back then, you just didn't lease everything you owned, right? This was the farm, the farmhouse, the barn, all the equipment in it, the furniture in the home. You were leasing everything in one, as one package. And my dad had never even met Gonzalo Mendez before this, but through Mr. Monroe, Gonzalo was also a customer at the bank of Frank Monroe. Mr. Monroe knew that Gonzalo had always wanted to be a farmer who wanted to be the boss of a farm, not the farm worker. And when he went to him and said, hey, Gonzalo, well, do you want a farm? I have ready-made farm you could lease. Gonzalo jumped at the chance. He thought it'd be great for his kids to grow up on a farm. His sister and her husband were going to bring their kids down and they were going to do this together. And so thanks to Frank Monroe, his kindness, collaboration, and building trusted friendships, our family was able to lease the farm to Gonzalo for those years in the war. And these are two pictures of the leases that they drew up. And these leases are now at Chapman University in their archives. So Gonzalo moves his family in the late spring to the farm. And Sylvia will say she had her birthday party at the farm. It was so much fun. They had a whole great summer together with her cousins on the farm, and then school was going to start. So when they went to register to go to the same school that my father and uncle and aunts had gone to, it was the closest school, they were denied entrance because they were Mexican. It was the color of their skin, it was their last name. And while for some reason that school let the Japanese students, my relatives, go to their school, they did not let the Mendez children go. So have to give a lot of credit to Gonzalo. He went to the school, he spoke to the principal, he spoke to the school superintendent, he went all the way to the county superintendent to try to resolve this. And they didn't continue to deny them to go to the regular 17th Street school. This is a photo of the Mexican school, and you could see all of the children are Mexican children. If the educational quality had been equal to 17th Street School, they might have had a justification. But this school, Sylvia would say, when she went there, she felt like they were just training her to be a maid or a servant or a farm worker. They were not giving her the English and the history and the math academic subjects that she had been used to at her previous school. And so based on that, Gonzalo took this up as his personal mission to desegregate this school. And I don't think he even thought of it that way. He just wanted to right this wrong. I don't think he even thought about how big of a case this would be at the time. But he definitely continues to talk with others. He finds out in meeting with other families that throughout Orange County, in fact, throughout California, every school district had the right to have segregated schools for Mexicans, for Asians, for Native Americans. There were segregated schools. It just depended what school district you went to. So that's why when he moved less than 10 miles from his home, he was now in a different school district with different rules. He, through a friend, and there's a really unique kindness involved in this, but Mr. Mendez meets David Marcus, who is an attorney in Los Angeles. Mr. Marcus is very interesting. While he is Jewish by heritage, he is known as the Mexican attorney because he has worked with the Mexican consulate. He also speaks Spanish. His wife was the daughter of a prominent Mexican physician, and their daughters were bilingual. So while he was Jewish, he really knew a lot about the Mexican culture and language. And he had started to fight for Mexicans in these segregated areas. And so Mr. Mendez hires Mr. Marcus with the profits from the asparagus crop. That's the money that he has. And he was hoping to use it to buy more land and have his own farm, but instead he pays Mr. Marcus to take this to court. In the process, he meets 4 other families who are willing to join the effort and to be listed as the et al. In the Mendez et al. Case. They're the Palominos, Ramirez, Estrada, and Guzman. So these 5 families are now the plaintiffs in this case against 4 other school districts. Mr. Marcus makes some key decisions, very strategic decisions. One is to file in US federal court, not in California state court. I think he did that because he knew that this case could have other ramifications for states like Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, which also had segregated schools and segregated public areas. The other thing that if he went to federal court, he could use the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, that citizens should be equally treated. And here's a case where citizens, these young students who were born in the US, were unequally treated. So by going to federal court, he could use these two as his to his advantage. And many people think that this is a race case of Mexican, but it's really more a case about citizens being equally treated based on the court justifications. Kindness is courage to stand for what is fair and just for all. And throughout this story, there's a lot of places where there were some other people who were being unequally treated, but as immigrants, they were too scared and had a lot of fear to stand up and say anything. And I think that's very common when you're the minority against a majority culture. It's very, very difficult to stand up for what is fair. But in fact, these 5 families were now in a class action lawsuit and representing about 5,000 school-age children in Orange County of Mexican heritage. And that's not to mention the other school districts outside of Orange County that had segregated against Asians and Native Americans. So Mr. Marcus now, in 1945, March, he files the case in LA at the federal court. And July, the trial begins. And the plaintiffs were the parents of those 5 families as well as their children. So they all had to go get dressed up, make the long drive without the big freeways we have now to downtown Los Angeles. And for 6 days, they sat in those trial rooms. Sylvia always says that she was so frightened. She was only 10 years old at this time. She was so frightened that she might be called to have to say something. But in fact, the children were not called to the trial, but they did sit through the whole trial while the parents were called to testify on behalf of the case. The case was tried before Judge Paul McCormick, and Judge McCormick took 7 months to decide on this case, which is a pretty long time. Especially while if you're Gonzalo Mendez, you're running a farm, you're also in the midst of this court case. And 1945 is also pivotal in the life of the Japanese American community because the war is now coming to an end. In August of that year, the US bombs Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrenders, and by September, World War II is at its closing, is ended. So in the meantime, my dad and Gonzalo knew that one day it does, in fact, Mr. Monroe was right, the war will end and our family could come back to the farm. However, Gonzalo's in the middle of this law case and he is in Westminster. He needs to stay in Westminster because of the court case. And oh, by the way, he spent all of his profit on this case, so he doesn't have the resources to just quickly open a new restaurant. So what they do is they collaborate for a win-win solution. In the second lease, the last lease of the farm, my dad and Gonzalo decide that when they are out of the incarceration camp, my dad and grandfather will work for Gonzalo for daily wages. They will live in one of those workers' cottages, and Gonzalo can take the profits from that year's crop to start his new business or his new venture after farming. I think by this time, Gonzalo had had enough of farming and was like, okay, I'm done with farming now. Let's go back to the restaurant business. But that was the win-win solution. So it's one of those trading places kind of situations where the person who's leasing the farm is now the boss of the two people who own the farm. And the two people who own the farm are now working for daily wages for Gonzalo so that he could take the profit for that year and go ahead and start his next venture when he hopefully could move out of Westminster and go back to his home that he owned in Santa Ana. So this is one of those really, I could totally see where my dad saw this making total sense. Everybody wins. Everyone has a place to live. We can work. Gonzalo could take the profit and they will have their farm back. But it is unusual in the fact that I think most people would not have guessed that this would have been one of the outcomes of leasing the farm. So I mentioned 7 months later, and finally, February 18th of the next year, 1946, Judge McCormick rules, and he rules in favor of the families. So these 5 families who had never been in a court before have now won a federal court case. A paramount requisite in the American system of public education is social equality. It must be open to all children, regardless of their lineage. So Judge McCormick, these words closed this case, but it was appealed by the other school districts, not Westminster, but by the other school districts. They still wanted to fight. And so then now the case goes to the Court of Appeals. But for Sylvia and her 2 brothers, Gonzalo and Jerome, they get to go to 17th Street School in Westminster. And now at this point, they're going with my 2 aunts as well. Aki and Kazi are going, they're all going to the same school, living on the same property. So as it goes to the Circuit Court of Appeals at the end of 1946, and just really quite shortly after, only 4 months after, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals upholds McCormick's ruling that says that it is not equal treatment if separate but not equal education is offered. So separate is not equal. Had that whole concept and phrase had its roots here in Mendez versus Westminster. Meanwhile, the California state government is kind of seeing the writing on the wall, because in January, they introduced the Anderson bill, and by June, I mean, they worked pretty fast. Only 6 months later, both the state assembly, state senate, and Governor Earl Warren has signed off to desegregate California state schools. And that is what was the in the Anderson bill. This picture is from 1931, and it's in front of the Westminster School. And you can see that it's all white children, but there are a few Japanese American children, my dad being one of them. And if you look kind of in the middle of the picture, there's a Japanese boy with overalls with this huge grin on his face, standing in front of the brick wall. That's my dad. So you could see the difference between this school that was integrated mostly white with a few Japanese, but there is no Mexican children in sight, versus the picture I showed you earlier that is all Mexican children. And that was only about a half a mile away from this school. Kindness is remembering what others have suffered with compassion and hospitality, even when you have suffered far worse. I mentioned that Poston was in the middle of the Colorado River Indian Tribe reservation, and they call themselves CRIT, C-R-I-T. This is a drawing of the area of land right on the eastern side of the Colorado River that is Poston and Parker, Arizona. And you can see those small little checkerboards in the middle are the Poston Unit 1 camp, Unit 2 camp, and Unit 3 camp. And together those three camps had almost 18,000 Japanese Americans incarcerated there. 17,814 to be exact, but almost 18,000. The reason I put this up is the Native Americans here in the Poston Parker area, along with the Poston Preservation Alliance, which is a Japanese American group, mostly people who had either survived the incarceration camps there or their descendants, have built a joint monument in Poston, Arizona to commemorate and remember the incarceration there. And in fact, they have a pilgrimage once a year. This year, it'll be in October. It was on hiatus due to the pandemic, but this year, for the first time in 3 years, they will be having the pilgrimage again. And it is really to remember this very cross-cultural heritage history story. But I think it's really interesting. When my mother went on a pilgrimage there, my parents did in about 1985, they were just so welcomed by the Native Americans. And my mother talked about how the women had cooked and made Navajo fry bread for the meals, and just the hospitality that they were shown. And I think that is part of the healing and the hope of collaborating and remembering the different stories, and very difficult stories. Obviously, the Native Americans have been moved and shifted. If anyone knows what it is like to be forcibly removed, it is certainly the Native Americans. And so I think this is just a story of kindness in the midst of very difficult times, in the midst of racism, several different kinds of racism, as well as collaboration by those who have shown kindness, and the type of kindness that is far healing and far more constructive than one might imagine. Kindness is sacrificing for the good of others. And I think through all the different parts of the story, there are major pivots where one person or a group of people or a family's kindness really gave our families hope. And I don't think I could have ever written a fictional story that includes so many different cultures and people groups, where we have Japanese Americans who were incarcerated, yet they fought and served in World War II as soldiers through the 442nd and 100th Battalion. We have Mexican American families that were denied equal education, but yet through Mendez versus Westminster, that led to the desegregation of all the districts in California, the whole state. We have a white banker, Mr. Monroe, who served his customers well, and he had customers of all colors, so he was definitely not a racist. We have a Jewish attorney, and we have a Catholic judge who uphold the Equal Protection Clause that lead to the desegregation of California state schools. And we even have Black attorneys from the NAACP. Robert Carter and Thurgood Marshall, as young attorneys with the NAACP, wrote an amicus brief letter of support for this case. And as I just mentioned, the Colorado River Indian Tribe and their collaboration with the Japanese Americans. there's not a lot of historical centers or sites that commemorate this part of history, but I think this is one of them. And it's right here in Orange County. It's right next to the county courthouse. A grateful arigato to Orange County from May 1970. My dad was on a committee, and this committee back then decided they wanted to build this Japanese garden with a beautiful ceramic blue tile and a 50-year-old bonsai. And they did this. The timing is very specific. 1970 was 25 years after they had returned to Orange County to their farms from the incarceration camps. But I thought it was very interesting when I look at the plaque, it says nothing about war. It says nothing about racism. It says nothing about being forcibly removed. What it does say is dedicated and presented for the pleasure of all people in Orange County by the Japanese American community. A grateful arigato in honor of our pioneers' fathers and for the blessings of freedom. And so if you go to the courthouse, if you're going to serve on a jury or just happen to be over there, just go over to that side of the building. It's on the right behind the tall tower, and you'll find this garden that really is saying thank you for letting us as Japanese Americans come back to our farms, come back to Orange County. There were places along the Pacific coast in these three states where the Japanese were not welcomed back after the war, that the resentments had still lingered, even though there was never any case proven of any kind of Japanese conspiracy or treason. But I think it's interesting that the focus here is on gratefulness, on blessings, and on thankfulness for being able to return to their farms and their homes. So this year we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of Mendez versus Westminster and school desegregation here, 7 years before Brown versus education. I think probably the theme of the stories in my book is this: kindness is respecting our differences, celebrating shared history, and moving forward as one humanity. I am also, through this, I have found that people are telling me some wonderful stories that go along with this collaboration between peoples and cultures. And so I'm sharing those on my website as thekindnessofcolor.com, and you can follow me on social media because I think it's really important for us to hear these stories of collaboration and how through history it's proven that we can work together and build strong communities regardless of some of the adversities that we're faced with. So that is the end of my presentation. And
thank you so much, Janice. We really appreciate your wonderful presentation and for sharing your family's history and that of the Mendez family as well. We have a few minutes for questions from the audience. And so for them, please submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. And we already have some questions, so let me jump right in. First question, the person writes, I'd love to hear more about the segregated schools for Asian American children. Could you share more?
Yeah, in Orange County, it wasn't Asian Americans that were segregated in schools. I think from what I understand, and I haven't done a ton of research on that, that was more prevalent in the Bay Area in San Francisco. And I said Asian Americans because it was probably a mixture of Chinese and Japanese. I often get asked too, what about Black Americans? And at that point in the California area, there were not that many African American communities. And so when you look back at the segregated school list, it doesn't mention Black Americans. And I think it's mostly a population distribution issue, that there weren't that many Black Americans. And so the focus was on these growing minority groups.
Great, thank you. So here's the next question. The audience member wrote, I remember my mom telling me stories about how she would walk by the Japanese camps as a child. Heartbreaking to think it really wasn't that long ago. So glad for the kindness you found along the way and the fight for the rights. Question, do you ever feel bitter about what happened?
Hmm. I get that question a lot, and my parents did not pass on resentment or bitterness to me. I think part of it was because they were so grateful, at least my father's family. My mother's family had lost a lot more. My father's family was able to come back and restart their farming. And I think this is where the kindnesses were so important, that they knew that they had Mr. Mendez working hard. I mean, Mr. Mendez, if you read the book, he did a number of things that showed such great integrity, that, I mean, he drove the lease money out to Arizona to the camp to make sure my father got it, because he didn't trust that my father would get it any other way. And so, I mean, he went out of his way to show his trustworthiness. I think it's things like that that helped my father to process through that. And I honestly think hard work, when you work in a farm all day like we did, hard work does a lot to be able to, work out those resentments and work out those, the bitterness that you might have. But my grandfather and my father were really quite cheerful people, honestly. It's not just me who says that. Other family friends said, oh yeah, we don't remember them harboring that. But I do think they were so grateful. There's a number of people in my book that I refer to where they were lifelong friends, and there was this lifelong gratitude for what they had done. And so I'm sure my dad was bitter. There are still people who lost a lot, and really, really, the trajectory of their lives changed significantly because of the hardships that they had. But I think we were blessed to be able to have someone like Mr. Mendez, who was a man of integrity, to hold on to the farm, to have a house to come back to, where many of the people did not, many of the Japanese Americans did not. So I think I'm fortunate my parents didn't pass bitterness and resentment on to me, but it is truth. We do have to understand. And there are ways where this part of history really impacted our daily lives, and things, the fears of my mom at 9/11. My mom and my aunt, my father had passed, but my mom and my aunt just went into severe PTSD because America was being attacked again. And so that was something that I had to deal with them, especially as older, they were in their 80s at the time. And so it was a really hard period of time. So that's not part of, I actually do mention this in the book about the post-traumatic stress that they encountered like 62 years later, because it wasn't dealt with. So there are parts of that. I don't harbor bitterness in that. I just really prefer to see how kindness gave us hope and brought us into a deeper community with people who supported and cared. And I think that's one of the things, the more I talk to people about this story, I think what it proves is we as people, we as communities, neighbors, families, friends, we can support each other in difficult times. Governments, organizations, school districts, institutions can put these boundaries and inflict things upon us unfairly. But our story shows that the kindness of a few really helped our families to persevere and to ultimately be free.
Thank you for that. We have another audience member who writes, I think my grandfather was in your picture and he was sent to Santa Fe because he worked in the Baston Shuri Ranch in Orange County and had maps of all the irrigation lines that were laid out in the hills. His family also went to Poston. So her question is, do you know where your father was taken by the FBI?
Yeah, my grandfather, the picture I showed was actually at Lordsburg, New Mexico. And I would love to connect with you, and because I'm going to get more information on that. But from Westminster, my grandfather went to the Tuna Canyon Detention Center in kind of the northeast part of LA, and then to Santa Fe, and then to Lordsburg. New Mexico. So most of the time he was in Santa Fe and Lordsburg. But whoever that was, I would love to connect with you. So and I don't know if you have that picture. Maybe you do. Maybe you have some other information. I'm actually meeting tomorrow with 3 people I've never met. One of them contacted me through the book and said, my grandfather and my 2 friends' grandfathers and your grandfather were all taken at the same time. And so we're meeting for lunch tomorrow. So whoever asked that question, I really would love to connect with you, because you may have something in common with these 3 gentlemen I'm having lunch with tomorrow. 3 new friends I haven't met yet. So that's all I know really about that history. I had to piece that part together because my grandfather didn't really talk about it. And we found this picture long after he had passed away. So I don't have a lot of specifics, but that's what I do know.
I'll make sure to connect you offline.
That'd be great.
Here's another question. Someone said that they didn't know until recently that students in the camp were able to go to college. Was this very common?
It was available. I think it was relatively common. When we talk about the forced incarceration, I mean, there were students at the community colleges, at UCLA, USC, all the universities along the West Coast, Japanese American students who were enrolled, and they were not allowed to stay. They had to go back to their families and then go back into the camps. So some of those students, if you were in the Midwest or to the East, they were able to lobby and get a release form. So to go to another school, they couldn't return to the West Coast, but to go to a Midwestern or Eastern school. Now, not all the colleges were anti-racist. Some of the colleges would not take applications from Japanese Americans. But the case I can talk about is my uncle, who was able to get a release. He went to the Midwest. He found a college that would take him as a Japanese American. It was Carleton College in Minnesota. And he went on to the University of Iowa and became a surgeon. He went to medical school and became a surgeon. So, and one of my aunts, my mother's sister, she went away to community college in Ohio. So there was that opportunity if you could get a release. And I think that also is kind of a diaspora thing, whereas now there are more Japanese in other parts of America because of this. Some of them decided to stay where they went to school or where they were able to work outside of the West Coast. I don't know by numbers how many people did that, but it was, I mean, so many of the Nisei second generation were in their teens and early 20s. So there was a large group of the children of the original immigrants who were college age. So there was this opportunity to do that. But how many as a percentage, I'm not sure.
So unfortunately, this will have to be our last question here because we're running out of time. So my apologies to everyone who has submitted other questions. The last question is, your family came from Kochi, which is known for sea fishing industry. So how did your family get involved in farming in California?
Wow, you know a lot about Kochi. They were actually farmers in Kochi too. So I have been there, it's been years, but we went with my grandmother, and there is a lot of farming, lots of pearls industry, lobster, etc. But our family, there's a hill, and it's in more of the agricultural area where they have farmed for years, decades, maybe millennium, because there's a little bamboo hill, and you go up it, and at the very top is the family cemetery with headstones, very simple headstones. That have Munemitsu in the kanji script, but we have always been farmers. So I don't know, maybe my grandfather, there is a famous Munemitsu who was a sword maker, and when I was in high school, I'm like, Grandpa, maybe this is our relative. And he adamantly said, no, we have always been farmers. He was very proud of that. So he didn't want to be related to the sword maker, I guess. But we were farmers. So, and I don't know, it'd be interesting if you're also from Kochi, I'd love to get in touch with you too. Or if you have relatives from Kochi.
I'll make sure to connect you.
Okay, thanks.
So, thank you so much, Janice. We are so grateful that you agreed to be our speaker, and thank you for sharing your experiences, your wisdom about cultivating kindness. That is so important. I want to encourage everybody to buy your book because it is fantastic. So thank you again very much, Janice.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So before we go, I'd like to invite you all to visit the exhibit we have on display right now at UCI in the Jack Langston Library. It's called Snapshots of Orange County in the 1940s, Spaces, Places, Faces. And this exhibit explores the cultural, economic, and political landscape of Orange County during the 1940s. It highlights the histories and experiences of diverse multicultural communities in Orange County, and it touches upon the themes of racism, incarceration, and desegregation that we've discussed today. And it shows how the introduction of Army and air bases brought soldiers and their families from all over the country, and that changed the demographics and cultural norms of our region. So this exhibit will be on display in the lobby of the Jack Langston Library during regular library hours until mid-October. For more information about the exhibit, please visit our website. UCI Libraries events and exhibits like these are made possible with the support from the UCI Libraries Gateway Society. And so I would like to invite all of you to become members of our Gateway Society, which helps support UCI's world-class research, teaching, and patient care, supports the library's role as a major information resource for the community, and sponsors public programs such as today's event. So for more information, please visit our website. And in closing, a recording of this event will be posted on the UCI Libraries YouTube channel, and the link to the recording will be included in a follow-up email to all registered attendees. Thank you all for joining us.